Thank you, Sam, and welcome. Folks, you should never underestimate the value of a good moderator. I've talked about Reg O for years and years, and, the title changes. Today we have Lending to Insiders Review and Update. The program at one time was called Regulation O, Lending to Insiders. And a moderator begins the program, and believe me, it was not the moderator we have today. Sam knows better. But the moderator started off with saying, Regulation 0, Review and Update. So it is Reg O, just in case there was any doubt. And folks, this is a good topic for me to deal with today. Like so many of you, over the last 10 days, I have been trying to get a handle on 3,500 pages of new Dodd-Frank regulations. And still a little overwhelmed about that. So to get to take a little break here and do a webinar for a couple hours on a topic that has not changed significantly by Dodd-Frank. There are 2 Dodd-Frank changes we're going to talk about here today, but all things considered, they're not overwhelming. They're manageable, quite manageable, actually. This particular regulation and law came into being way back in 1978. The original law was the Financial Institutions Regulatory and Interest Rate Control Act of 1978. And folks, the title there doesn't even hint at Reg O. This is one of those little add-ons they bury into a bigger bill. But in the late 70s, we're having a huge problem with interest rate volatility. President Carter had changed the way we were managing the economy, and the Federal Reserve Board had changed, and rates went crazy. And there was a period of time in the late 70s, right before this law was going into effect, where mortgage rates were 15, 18% high. I mean, crazy stuff. So the law was primarily dealing with that issue and allowing interest on some deposit accounts to change, and it was all locked in before, but they were able to control, anyhow. They made a lot of changes like that, and Reg O was just dumped in there. Now, the way Reg O came to the attention of Congress was when Jimmy Carter got elected president. He'd been governor of Georgia, and he becomes president, and it was, a typical election year, a bunch of people running in the primaries, and Jimmy Carter was kind of a dark horse. I mean, he was known for being governor of Georgia, but wasn't considered to be that viable a candidate for president. Well, all of a sudden he gets elected. And people were a little surprised. Where did he come from? How did he do this? And they started looking back at actions taken by his committee. And they were kind of home-financed a little bit. Whereas oftentimes the Democratic Party, the Republican Party that provides a lot of the financing, they were doing things pretty much on their own. And it was a much different time. And they were kind of shocked. And when they started looking back at it, they found some things that didn't look quite right. And he looked at Jimmy Carter's campaign chairman. It was a gentleman named Burt Lance. And by the time this law was about to happen, Burt Lance was part of the administration. Okay, so bottom line, they passed this law that prohibited some of the activity engaged in by the Carter presidential campaign. And as a result of kind of the scandal, Burt Lance lost his position with the administration, and he headed back home to Georgia. Now, he lived in Calhoun, Georgia, and he ran a bank there, Calhoun National Bank. And so when he went back to Georgia after he was run out of Washington, he went back to running his bank. And his bank engaged in a lot of the practices that have been outlawed by PRICA and Regulation O. So it wasn't long before he was cited for violations of the law. And folks, a lot of people called FRICA, the Reg O provisions of FRICA, the Burt Lance Act. So he was cited for violating the Burt Lance Act. And then he violated him again, and before long, he was kind of banned from banking because they couldn't quite keep him in line. Even after he was booted out of the bank, he was still in Calhoun, Georgia. And years ago, I had some very nice ladies from the bank attend a program I did in Georgia. And I recognized the name of the bank and asked how Mr. Lance was doing, and they said he was in fine health, and he was in the bank every day. He didn't work there anymore, but he came down and visited with everybody, and so he was one of those love him or hate him kind of guys, I guess. But that was the background. That's why they passed this law, because of those abusive practices. Now, the later law we have to concern ourselves with is the Dodd-Frank Act. That happened in July 21st, 2010. And you're aware of the huge changes that it made, but it made two subtle changes here that we'll talk about a little later. And, folks, I have found that most banks kind of just missed them. There were very small provisions buried in this 2,000-plus page law called the Dodd-Frank Act. The Fed or none of the other agencies have developed any regs for these new provisions. There's no indication at this point if they will develop regs or not. So it's been overlooked, but it's in the law. It's fully in effect, and we'll get you up to speed on that. Now, Reg O, I should mention, is a safety and soundness concern. You know, we have most of the regs that I talk about are regs that are handled in a compliance examination. You know, there's a few, like this one, that are handled in safety and soundness. So this is much more of a safety and soundness type exam issue. All right, now, purpose. What we're looking at here is the purpose of the law overall is to provide information that's needed here for ongoing compliance, including these new Dodd-Frank revisions. And what we want to accomplish today is we are going back and reviewing the basic requirements. You know, you've got to periodically refresh yourself on this stuff. So we're going to go back and look at issues like who is an insider in your bank. We'll talk about the prohibition against preferential treatment, requirements for prior approvals. There's lending limits for all insiders. There's special lending limits for executive officers. There's a restriction on overdrafts for certain insiders. One of the new provisions deals with purchases of or sales of assets to insiders. So you can't, there's restrictions on purchasing assets from or selling assets to an insider. So we'll get you up to speed on that. And then we're also going to talk about an issue that's come up from time to time on how do you apply Reg O to a newly elected or newly appointed insider. You know, they have debt with your bank, and now they become a director, okay? Or they are an officer at your bank, and they have borrowings that are perfectly legal, comply with everything, but they were previously not an executive officer for Reg O. Now they are. How does that affect that existing debt? It's an old issue. It's been out there since Reg O first came into existence, but we want to revisit the issue because I've gotten a number of questions. Also, I have a consultant that I work with periodically up in Pennsylvania, and Evie contacted me recently with some questions about this. And so that kind of reminded me, this is something, if Evie's having a problem with this with her bankers in Pennsylvania, other bankers elsewhere are having this problem. So I've spent some time on this issue recently for a variety of reasons. All right. Over on page 2, we give you the background. We give you the citation to FRICA, okay? We talk a little there about Dodd-Frank. The regulation is Regulation O, the Federal Reserve Board's Regulation O. There are no amendments yet based on the Dodd-Frank changes. And again, there can be, but there haven't been yet. We're not sure if the CFPB will be drafting something there, if the Federal Reserve Board is going to draft something, or who, if anybody, might do something. We talk about interpretations, and folks, one thing about Reg O, and it's not like Reg Z or Reg B or some of those other regs that many of you work with regularly. There is no official staff commentary. You got the law, you got the regulation, that's kind of it, except there are tons of interpretations out there. But every agency publishes their own. There's no single body of work that has all the interpretations. And sometimes you find that one agency's issued an interpretation, they discuss a particular issue of concern, but the other agencies haven't. And the other agency might be the agency that regulates your bank, so they haven't addressed it at all. So does one of the other agencies' interpretation apply to your bank? And it's confusing. We wish there was one single, unified official staff commentary for Reg O. It'd make things a lot easier. And, folks, when we were pulling together the material that appears towards the end of the book on existing insiders and how you handle them, we were pulling opinions back from 1980. And I know for a fact there's opinions that are older than that. But, when they started putting stuff on the Internet,